Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the Center for National Security and Cooperation's weekly research seminar. For those of you who are new or are joining us online, my name is Harold Trinkunas. I'm the Deputy Director. I'll also be moderating this discussion today. And it's a real pleasure to welcome Dr. Maya van Nuys, who is a postdoctoral scholar here at CSAC this year. For that, she was a Neuberger Family Distinguished Fellow at the University of Chicago, where she received her PhD in political science. She also has her MA in political science from the same institution. Maya's research combines critical and mainstream approaches to the legacies of empire in conflict dynamics and state building, and she'll be talking to us today about her research on international organizations and the paradox of democratic policing. So before we go to invite Dr. van Nuys up to the podium. If you're online, you can always enter your questions at any time in the Q&A function of Zoom. And for those of you in the room, we will follow the one finger, two finger rule. One finger to get on the queue, two fingers to jump in at the matter immediately at hand. And as per CSAC custom, the first two or three questions will go to at least custom in the research seminar. The first two or three questions will go to our fellows and to students. Without much further ado, Maya, welcome.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Is this good? Okay, wonderful. Well, thanks so much for being here. It's exciting to share some research with you today. I'm going to mainly focus on giving an overview of my book project, which is the main thing I'm working on while here at CSAC. But the second half, I do want to open up a discussion on a paper project that is emerging from the book project that I'm hoping to get some feedback on. We'll begin with an overview of the book project. My book started with the observation that these are which is oriented outward. However, police have never solely been a domestic enterprise. For example, colonial governments exerted great influence over policing in their territories, and colonial policing policies would boomerang back, in the words of Aimé Césaire and Foucault, to the colonial metropoles, where they've had a lasting impact on almost every national policing organization. And today, there still exists an entire constellation of international actors that continue to impact domestic policing. One of the most prominent actors is the United Nations. And take, for example, recent UN missions in Haiti. So the UN has conducted 6 operations in Haiti. There's a 7th ongoing stabilization mission, all of which have included policing components and which have widely been regarded as either ineffective or inconclusive in their ability to improve civilian trust in police and the government and to reduce overall levels of violence. And so the book begins with the question, how do international organizations and private security companies as international actors influence domestic policing? And more specifically, why is there a greater likelihood which they share a history of consolidation and conflict, that the policies that result are more coercive, more militarized than international standards would suggest. And this is a multi-methods research project based on qualitative data, interviews, original interviews with international organization police advisors, archives from the UN policing components, as well as an event ethnography of several international policing conferences where I was able to get a better idea of the role of the private security actors in international policing. And the book finds, I argue, that international organizations and private security companies tend to prioritize security or short-term order over norms around democratic policing. And that individual reformers reinforce this trend because they assume that reform contexts are less amenable to democratic policing itself. And this book makes several key contributions. First, I bring policing empirically and theoretically into the study of international relations through several ways. First, speaking to issues of international order, and especially how international actors use reforms of domestic order to create sort of models of international order more broadly. I also speak to issues of international cooperation and global governance, specifically looking at how international organizations impact domestic policing norms, and increasingly how private security is playing a role in domestic security policies and practices. And finally, speak to the literature on norm diffusion, especially the more critical bent that has challenged sort of the normatively positive valence of the liberal internationalist discourse on norm diffusion. I also bring new data sources to bear, and today I'm going to focus on evidence from my interviews with international organization bureaucrats, while also providing a more unified explanation for failures of democratic police reforms across contexts. And so this is the structure of the book as it stands. I begin with a theory for the global governance of policing and its decoupling effects, before then moving through 3 periods of the global governance of policing. So that first period is policing under colonial governance, as I briefly alluded to. So here you can see a picture of the Royal Irish Constabulary. This was a British counterinsurgency force meant to quell dissent in British Ireland. They were also a fundamental model for policing across the British Empire and at home, because they were the fundamental model for the Peelian Police, the first London Metropolitan Police, which continues to serve as a model for civilian policing today. Now, with the fall of formal empire, I argue that a second stage emerges that I call the human rights-oriented era of policing, that is led by IOs like the United Nations, who now have resources and legitimacy to impact domestic policing norms. And I argue that while they focus on human rights-oriented policing, which is another way of saying democratic policing, I'll talk more about that later, they often reinforce short-term order over efforts to democratize police. Finally, the emergence in the last 20 or 30 years of private security companies as especially prominent actors in international police reform and international policing more broadly. So these might be contractors that provide expertise to police under reform, as well as companies that provide materials to police internationally. And so this is a photo from one of the conferences I attended, the World Police Summit in Dubai last May, just to give you an idea of sort of the private companies that are exhibiting and what it looks like at these exhibits. And the key for this last evolution of global policing is I argue that decoupling occurs as a focus on policing as something that can be objective and data-driven without the recognition that these data and the way that they are processed are inherently subjective and often biased. So returning to the broader book structure, the remainder of the talk, I'm going to provide an overview of the theory, my book's theory, before then moving on to this paper, which has emanated from the book. It's a specific paper from the book research that I'm hoping to publish, focused on that second period, the human rights-oriented era of policing, looking at evidence from IO bureaucrats and their conceptualization of democratic policing as a norm. So for the remainder of the talk, I'm going to go into the book theory before then describing the theory for the paper, which focuses on problematizing democratic policing, before moving to the data and methods I use for the paper, which come from the book project, my interviews, talking about my findings, and ending with some conclusions and directions for future research. So the book's theory, again, is addressing the research question, why is there a consistent gap between international standards and the actual policies and performance of international police reform? So to answer this question, I propose a 3-stage norm diffusion process. In the first stage of norm emergence, international organizations define standards for international policing by producing publicly available guidance for domestic law enforcement. And I call this guidance structuring norms. Now, I borrow the term norm emergence from Finnemore and Sekink's early article on norm diffusion, but I'm focused on IOs here as the key norm entrepreneurs. Now, the second stage of norm articulation, reformers and states and IOs make policies that are meant to comply with structuring norms. So I call this phase norm articulation. And then the final stage of norm application, bureaucrats and field officers on the ground apply the articulated policies in practice. Now, the key to the global governance of policing in my theory is that there is a decoupling between each of these stages. I remember that decoupling refers to a gap between the structuring norms, the goals, and the actual policies and activities that then follow. And however, this is where I enter into some new space with the paper. So this is how the book is structured. This was my job talk that I gave in the fall. But considering more about the concepts of the norms at the structuring norm stage, I proposed a somewhat new theoretical diagram. So instead of thinking about it as a top-down process, I think it's better conceived of as a cyclical process, because individuals who are performing these reforms are constantly reflecting on past reforms as they influence new reforms in the future. And really key here is to show that norms don't emerge, out of nowhere as some perfect concept. Because what this paper is trying to do is to problematize democratic policing as a norm and show that without a coherent norm, diffusion is of course going to fail to achieve the normative aims. So then there are three mechanisms behind this decoupling. At the first stage, IOs do not always consistently and clearly define norms for policing. In the second stage of norm articulation, international actors tend to prioritize short-term order over democratic principles. And finally, individuals reinforce this trend because they artificially restrict reform possibilities. They see that democratic policing, they argue, it is less viable in reform context because of their understanding of the culture of the reform context. And so moving on now, this is the paper. The theory that I'm generating for the paper, which is a critical analysis of the concept of democratic policing. Now, this is clearly very relevant today because police are becoming more militarized globally. And we've seen that very clearly in Minnesota over the last several weeks. We've seen that in the US over the last several years, indeed. And this is in spite of the fact that IOs like the United Nations have consolidated norms for civilian policing as the ideal. And they understand civilian policing to be democratic policing, which is reliant on not being tied in with military infrastructure, both formally and informally. So then the paper question is, how do IOs conceptualize democratic policing? And then why do these democratic police reforms so often fail? I'm speaking to several literatures here. First, there's been a broad critical policing scholarship that points to the fact that police has always been militarized to some degree. And this is really a key part of understanding the colonial history of policing. Because colonial police forces were essentially counterinsurgency forces, and because of the colonial boomerang, these have had lasting impacts on every policing organization. And so police is not so much, are they demilitarized or not, but on a range from more or less militarized, where are they? And even aside from the critical takes, there are findings that police have become more militarized globally in the last 20 or 30 years. So there's a period of civilianization, which has been cut by a more recent trend towards globalization. This is despite the fact that there are studies showing that this militarization is ineffective for counterinsurgency, and despite norms existing at the international level for civilian policing as the ideal democratic approach. And also, this is in the face of a lot of research that shows that democratic reforms or reforms trying to make police more accountable often fail to achieve their aims, both in the domestic sphere, within single case studies of within country, as well as globally, whether these be interventions applied by global actors in a specific space or these broader international reform projects that I'm really speaking to today. And much of the research on the failures behind these international reform projects blames the actual policies and the implementation for their failure. This occurs in a myriad of different ways, either prioritization of donor over recipient interests, a lack of policing knowledge, a lack of knowledge of the local context itself, which harkens back to Otisser's 2014 Peaceland, and finally, the practicalities of implementation, like the difficulty inherent in moving from concepts to practice. And of course, these are all very relevant, but what's striking is when you talk to policing advisors and when you read practitioner reports, the fact that these emerge as problems over and over and over again. And so my goal with this paper is to take a step back and ask whether these are actually symptoms of poor conceptualization rather than themselves a cause of failures for democratic policing reforms. So now we come to the problem of defining democratic policing. First, I work on defining policing, fairly straightforward, although there is an older definition, right, that was more popular in the 18th and 19th centuries, which was a broader understanding of Foucauldian governmentality of social control, right? So in this definition of legislative and administrative regulation of the internal life of a community for the social order. Now, with the consolidation of nation states, now we can understand police better as a group empowered by the state to repress crime and to maintain law and public order. And this isn't to undermine the importance of understanding policing as a broader phenomenon, but today I'm really focused on this understanding of police as a specific uniformed force empowered by the state to use force for preservation of the state's monopoly on the use of force. I said force a lot. Now defining democracy, right? This is the easy part. And there's so much literature on this, I'm not going to go into it. And this is where I would really welcome feedback too, on what literatures I should be engaging. But I do want to make it clear that I want to move beyond electoral understandings of democracy here. So a lot of in comparative politics understandings of democracy focus on defining a democratic country with the nation state as the unit of analysis based on competitive elections. This doesn't work so well for my purposes because I'm not only looking beyond the nation state to international actors, but I'm also looking at policing, which while it can have to do with electoral processes, is not solely relegated to those processes. And so for now, I move towards a deliberative understanding of democracy, a deliberative or discursive definition of democracy, which really focuses on the importance of civilian conversation and dialogue in the public sphere. Broad participation, critical self-reflection on the part of every actor involved, but especially those who are making and implementing the policies, and robust civilian oversight and input throughout the process, and as well as after any sort of reform process is finished. So now we put the two together. What is democratic policing? So right now I'm going to share some definitions that exist from practitioner sources. These are what I would call structuring norms based on my theoretical diagram, before I talk about how the actual individuals who do this work understand and apply these concepts. So you'll see that the definitions themselves are a little bit shaky, although we do get some progress towards understanding what it might mean to have a democratic police. First, this is a Google Ngram for the term democratic policing. So you can see a very brief spike here. This is when it first emerges in legal scholarship. And obviously, relatively, these are very infrequent uses anyways. But you can see a large spike in the 90s up through the 2000s and 2010s, which really coincides with that period of increased international humanitarian projects and reforms focused on democratic policing. In the most basic sense, in doing the readings and talking with folks, democratic policing might be understood as that which occurs in a democracy, or that which is the opposite of what occurs in an autocracy. Well, this is a fairly unhelpful definition, but it is a starting point. However, we know that there is authoritarian policing or outcomes in democratic countries, right? In the US in particular, we have evidence that increased engagement with police and marginalized groups can lead to lower civilian trust in police and can reduce their democratic engagement at various levels, national and more community. And finally, a long history of racial and sexual violence committed by police against civilians in and outside of democracies. So moving beyond this critique, there is one key definition that appears regularly amongst experts. And this is David Bailey's 2001 definition of democratic policing from a guidebook he wrote for the US Department of Justice. And so he outlines 4 norms: that a democratic police prioritizes the needs of individual citizens and private groups, that they are accountable to the law and not the government or the executive in power at the moment, they protect human rights, and they are transparent. Now, this is a starting point, but I do want to note a few qualms that a more deliberative democratic approach might have. First, it is unclear what the balance between individual needs and private groups should be. Second, the second point assumes that the law is stable and legitimate to the people. Protecting human rights is obviously important, although we know that there are some rights that tend to conflict with one another based on social, economic, communal, or individual rights. And how to negotiate those differences is not clear from this definition. And finally, transparency. I mean, this is everyone should be transparent, but clearly lacking some sort of operationalization of what that should look like. The UN actually provides a much simpler definition, where democratic policing is representative of the people it serves. This does harken back a little bit to a more electoral understanding of democracy, right? Where the idea here is that a democratic police is enforcing laws that have been determined through a democratic process. However, even people in the UN note that there is some reservation of using the term democratic policing. They might use human rights-oriented policing instead, or protection of civilians in place of democratic policing as a term. But in essence, these mean the same thing. So I often see human rights-oriented policing used as a synonym for democratic policing. Finally, a definition from another IO, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And I put this whole thing here because I do think it's very striking how much longer this is, right, than the UN definition. And this is actually only the first bullet point of 3 in this guidebook on democratic policing. But I will point to the last part of the definition, which says that progress towards democratic policing is made when there's a shift from a control-oriented approach to a more service-oriented approach, which does sort of gel with an understanding of democratic policing as that which occurs in a democracy and vice versa. So in order to better understand, well, how do individuals involved in these reforms actually, what do they take from these definitions, and how do they define democratic policing and apply it? I conducted interviews with over 40 international organization bureaucrats. These are individuals who worked either directly for or with international organizations for police reform projects at the international level. And I supplement this original data with transcripts from Princeton's Innovations for Successful Societies project. This project conducted hundreds of interviews with international experts on reform, including a subset of police accountability experts. And so during these conversations with people with experience working on international policing reforms, I find that they are unable to provide consistent definitions or operationalizations of democratic policing. At first, there is amongst experts a trend towards this tautological definition of regime type being linked to the type of policing. So there are 2 main models, according to some interviewees: democratic policing in democracies where the police serves the people, and autocratic policing in non-democracies. This might be an authoritarian regime, a monarchy, where the police serves the state. In this interview, this policing NGO advisor argued that the role of police in democracy is to enforce what the community tells them they accept as standards of behavior. And so here we see the centralization of community input. And follow me with where I'm going here. Is democratic policing the same as community-oriented policing? It's something that comes up. So for those who study policing, community-oriented policing is a very common phrase. It's probably something everyone has heard, especially in the wake of George Floyd's murder. But community-oriented policing has been around for more than 100 years, and it's only been sort of defined as such in the last 30 or 40. And really what it refers to is a philosophy of policing that centers communities as both partners and customers for security provision. And this really matches with that democratic definition that we saw in the previous slide, that they enforce what the community tells them. So a community-oriented police is one that works directly with and for the community. When talking, though, to international experts and asking directly, is democratic and community policing, are they interchangeable? I got several different answers. So again, this is from an international police advisor working in the EU context. I do want to note, again, the length. Sometimes the length of it I keep because it's interesting to show you. When asked, are democratic and community-oriented policing the same thing? This was clearly not an easy question to answer. You can see a lot of ellipses, a lot of equivocation. But they note that you have, for example, Jordan as a monarchy, and there can be community policing there, especially if you define community and democratic policing as that which respects universal human rights. So then this interviewee said, yes, it could apply anywhere. And so then one might substitute democratic for community-oriented policing. Another international policing NGO advisor, when I asked directly, do you think a community-oriented police can still exist in an authoritarian context, argued absolutely they can. Because community-oriented policing is actually about reducing barriers between communities and the police and improving communications. And that when they're talking about a distinction between democratic and authoritarian policing, they're talking about who decides what gets enforced. However, it's unclear how you have a community-oriented police if the idea of community orientation is to enforce what the community wants you to enforce. Others further complicated this idea that the type of police is related to the regime type. So in one interview, when I asked, how easy it is to implement community policing in an authoritarian or post-authoritarian context, one interviewee said, there are also difficulties in democratic countries. It can't be just that democratic institutions are safer and stronger and better, like I learned in my undergrad in political science. And, another interviewee pointed out that it really depends on your positionality as a citizen in your society. So they argue that there is a dual relationship for police depending on where you are and where you fit in, that the same person might experience a more or less militarized or democratic police depending on their identity and their relative position in society. This is a very important point. And I think these diffuse understandings, so you see in these interviews with international police advising experts, there is an opening for thinking more critically about what democratic policing could mean and how we could apply it. Because there's a lot of recognition of sort of these fuzzy lines between militarized and non-militarized police and the difficulties in sort of applying them and how regime type does or doesn't affect the possibilities. But instead of having this sort of generative opening for, okay, well, let's actually set out some very clear, or at least start a conversation, right, in a deliberative democracy sense for determining aspects of democratic policing that might be widely applicable, I find that these experts tend to retrench into a neo-colonial view of certain spaces as just not amenable to democratic policing. So failures of democratic policing then become a problem, not of conceptualization, but of the culture receiving the reform. And this comes out in the way that interviewees talked about policing as a cultural artifact. So in this interviewee noted that they think the biggest difference in policing across contexts is cultural. Not necessarily a problem, except for the way that culture is operationalized. So in this quote, another police advisor argued that communities in emerging countries are fundamentally different than those in low crime, high legitimacy countries like Denmark and New Zealand. They provide as examples. As a result, these emerging country communities will find it much more difficult to have democratic or community policing, and that the concepts, the norms of democratic policing go out the window. So they kind of go out the window. And so it really begs the question of why have a norm for democratic policing that you're trying to institute in reforms that the reformers themselves don't think it's plausible or possible to implement it, based on some surface level understanding of the community and its ability to promote democratic policing. And this becomes pretty clear in some subsequent interviewee quotes. An EU police advisor argued that when you do democratic elections in a place like Afghanistan, they have no clue what that means in Afghanistan, they being Afghan people. And if you don't understand the tribal systems there and try and impose democratic policing, it has nothing to do with the reality on the ground. Another advisor who had worked on policing reform in Iraq and Afghanistan argued that they went to their supervisor and said, "Sir, what are we talking about bringing democracy?" They don't know what it is. They'd probably be scared of it because it means they have to make a decision on their own. And this really is reminiscent of paternalist discourses justifying liberal empire. But in the second part of the quote, they do note colonization as an aspect that has impacted the ability for policing to be more democratic. But they end with, they have no foundation for what we're talking about when we talk about democratic policing. This really forecloses a lot of options at the very beginning, right? If your goal is to promote more democratic police, but you think there's no basis for democratic policing in society, that really impacts what choices you're going to make as a reformer. And this is clear that what cultures are not more amenable tend to kind of follow the West and non-West divide. So in this interview from the Princeton project with the chief of the EU coordination office for the police mission in Bosnia, argued that he was wary that cultural differences as an argument affected reform outcomes, at least in the Western Balkan context. And this relates really to perceptions in especially Bosnia that having a more European style, especially after the UN mission, policing mission, was more successful because people had shared understandings and histories of democracy or what policing should do. Now, this conception of policing as cultural matters because it tends to make reformers assume, expect, or accept that more coercive policing is almost a natural aspect of these reform contexts. So in this quote from a UN police advisor from Scandinavia, they argue when they started in their police 20, 30 years ago, it was all about sticks and batons and beating up protesters. But that basically now that's like ancient times, but of course in a lot of other countries, they still do that. And this quote to me is one indication of a naturalization of more coercive policing outside of more developed democracies. And it's not necessarily that I'm arguing there is no evidence that there's variation in sort of police use of force and power, but the argument that it is indelible, that it is a fact of the context and not a product of social and political circumstances. So in conclusion, I've argued that the IO-led democratic police reforms cannot help but to fail because they're poorly conceptualized. So if you have a diffusion process, at first I was critiquing the articulation and application of these norms, but it's also important to interrogate the norm itself and whether or not it's cohesive and coherent amongst those applying it. Because there's not a clear definition or understanding of it or conversations around it, these reformers they can't effectively apply reforms if they don't have a clear understanding of the goals and their possibilities. Moreover, reformers then assume that democratic policing is less viable in certain reform contexts, especially those that share a history of colonial expropriation and conflict, which tend to be where most reforms happen, which really, again, begs the question of why even have the concept if you're assuming it's not viable in the locations that receive reforms. And one thing I'm still thinking about that I welcome input on is, do the goals of deliberative democracy actually contradict those of a national police, of the ideal type of a national police? If deliberative democracy is about genuine citizen engagement, sort of a decentralized, regular model of public debate, can you square this with a sort of top-down hierarchical state police? That's a question, and I think I lean towards no, but I'm very open to discussing that, and that probably also depends on how you define democracy, deliberative democracy specifically. But there are many implications for this study. For one, the role or the lack thereof of democracy in international order building shows that it's important to think about, the democratic nature of international security sector reform and whether or not there are possibilities for a more democratic version. I'm also able to explain disappointing reform outcomes across contexts. And it's not necessarily only a matter of implementation. Of course, things like resources, local buy-in, and expertise affect the quality of reforms. But we should also think about if those are consistently coming up as obstacles. Is it the concept itself, too, that needs reform or reworking? And finally, that norm diffusion relies on there being a coherent norm to diffuse. Much of the international relations research really focuses on whether or not norms successfully or unsuccessfully diffuse. But here I really want to question the content of this norm in particular. Now, policy implications. So this is difficult because in some ways this project is a real indictment of sort of the normative policy process as it exists now. So it as kind of a cop-out, I would say, it really shows the importance of critical perspectives on policing. That having understandings of the colonial histories involved with policing, the abuses against marginalized groups is essential to developing policies to improve that, because without that knowledge, you can't address those lingering associations. Now, if pressed to give a clear policy outcome, I would say it's going to be a negative instead of a positive, but certainly improving knowledge of the local context amongst reformers is not necessarily going to improve decoupling or improve the outcomes of democratic policing. Contrary to Otisser's Peaceland argument, because the problem here is not always that police experts don't understand the local context, it's that their understanding of the local context is fulfilling whatever their bias or their understanding of the context is ahead of time. It's like a confirmation bias, right? So they understand these spaces to be less amenable to democratic policing, and learning more about it does not necessarily counteract this assumption, which is really rooted in colonial understandings of especially non-Western states experiencing conflict as inherent security risks that are also more violent by their nature. So the next steps, right, for this particular paper, which is an outcome from the book project research, is to refine the theory. So you have a lot of work to do there. Expand interviews. I'm conducting more interviews this quarter, and to apply perhaps some of this theoretical insight to archival cases. Right now I have archival documents of UN policing components, and to think through how these work in practice. So I'll end with just a slide on my research agenda. My primary research agenda really focuses on what I call the underexplored internationalism of policing. And the first project is my book project, Reforming Policing, Reproducing Power. Also, this paper project, IOs and the Paradox of Democratic Policing. I have another paper with a colleague at the University of Kansas that measures the impact of UN police components on human rights outcomes in areas that receive them. And finally, a more theoretical piece on the contradictions and concurrences between artificial intelligence and community-oriented policing that I'll be presenting at ISA in a month or so. So I'll end there, and I look forward to your questions.
Hey, I see start in the back, then Elizabeth, then Kevin, and then maybe Dippin. Austin.
Protocol. I'm Austin Gruber, a visiting scholar here at CSAC. Thanks, Mike. I really enjoy your refinement of your theory as an iterative process. I think that's a really good piece there. You talked a lot about the bifurcation of an autocratic versus democratic policing, and with the democratic policing being focused on those social norms, and you brought up Minnesota as well. Just kind of curious your thoughts on where the law and social norm split and the role of democratic policing in those type of situations. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks.
Oh man. Easy. Okay, so the difference between social norms and law. I mean, here's the thing. Law, and any police officer will recognize this, is constantly contradicting itself. In more countries than others. I mean, I have family in Italy. It's just it's a nightmare. And so a lot of what this comes down to is police discretion in implementing the law. And that doesn't always necessarily match with social norms or with what would be a deliberative democratic process of determining what are actually the priorities of citizens. So that's where I see, like, you can't rely solely on the law, because in and of itself often contradicts itself. It's fairly static, and like I tried to point out, not always legitimate to the people who are experiencing it. I'm not saying, go break all the laws. That's not what I'm trying to say, but I do think it's important to think a little bit more critically about law as some sort of, normative good that exists out there. Does that even begin to answer your question? Like in Minnesota, this is near and dear because I lived in Minneapolis for the last several years before I moved here, in South Minneapolis. What does this mean? I mean, in many ways, this is a representation of breaking the norm of civilian policing, because ideally any sort of police body should not be used against a domestic population. And I know they make arguments, right, that, well, it's an immigration process and they are in the border kind of to Canada, but this is a border police, which do tend to be more militarized in any other country. Sometimes they're a paramilitary force. And so I think the outcry has really been as a result of, this is not what the police are supposed to be doing. That's how some people in Minneapolis feel, not all of them. But that is one of the outcomes. Does that get close to answering your question?
Yeah. I use that as a vignette, but
Yeah.
really just to me, when I look at that democratic policing, the law is not clear.
Sure. I see what you mean, right? So, and then that is a version of, that's not a deliberative democracy approach, but like a more constitutional approach that really focuses on laws being, where we can look to outline these sorts of norms. But as I said, I think that's kind of a false promise.
Okay, I got Elizabeth next, and there's a number of people who raise their hands, so ask your best question. And if you want to ask a second question, we can put you the queue at the end.
Amazing. Okay, thank you so much. This was such a pleasure to get to listen to and see how it's developed. So a very hopefully simple question. I'm wondering who benefits from this poor conceptualization? Is it intentional, or is it just a byproduct of something else? Thanks so much.
Yeah, I mean, I think like any situation of power, it's a little bit of A, a little bit of B, right? There are people that benefit. Clearly, like private security companies, there are people who rely on this system for their jobs. And that might not be a conscious sort of exploitation, but the people who are involved in international police reform often very much want to help, but their job is to be participating in this sort of system of reform. So in some ways I question sometimes, like, what's the real motivation? That's kind of a meta critique. Sorry, I'm thinking a little bit more about that now, because that is a really good question. And then, sorry, I was just gonna say, in some ways, what benefits is the sort of the status quo, the continuation of the system, which is a somewhat simpler thing to maintain. So the benefit of that is just the powers that are
Maya.
Hi.
Wonderful talk.
Thank you.
I want to interrogate this issue of democratic policing as a flawed concept.
Mhm.
So I think about democracy. I think about it as the system that's inclusionary, but also simultaneously exclusionary.
Yep.
If you're part of the political community, you're entitled to all the rights and privileges that come with it. And if you're outside of it, and the farther you get outside of it, the less entitled you are to these rights and privileges. Right? So on the one hand, inclusionary, you get everything. Exclusionary, you're not part of the community. You don't get it. Now, I wonder if the problem with democratic policing is not the concept itself, but the application to it in a one-size-fits-all manner. So, for like you mentioned, this idea that there's authoritarian policing in democratic countries, but that occurs for members of the United States that are a bit more outside of what we consider the political community, right? So, like in the literature you're citing, like they're primarily targeting poor and Black communities.
Yep.
But when I'm out in Palo Alto, people are happy with the police. Like, it seems perfectly fine. And so for me, like, isn't that the problem? Is that the problem with democratic policing is that it works fine if you have perfectly well-integrated political community, but in reality, communities are not that perfectly well-integrated. Like, there's real inequalities. And so the problem with democratic policing is that you're papering over this one-size-fits-all thing over these inequalities. But in reality, like, democratic policing works just fine for people who are clearly part of the community, rich,
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very fair point. One thing I will say is that again makes it sort of a problem of implementation, right? Or at least that the reality that exists is not amenable to it. Which in some ways, I'm like, well, that doesn't matter. It's still a flawed concept if reality doesn't match it. But I will engage with your debate on the flawed concept itself, with the idea that from the understanding of recognizing, the United States as a democratic country, these are based on definitions like from VDEM or something. So it's not necessarily the more deliberative framework that I'm looking to. So in that sense, that explains it, because democratic policing might be successful in that sense if you understand democracy to be defined by, competitive electoral policies. But yeah, this is really great because this is where I need to think a little bit more clearly about things. The other question that I come up with a lot is democracy. There's a lot of critiques of democracy based on sort of like the history of liberal empire. And so is there a way, is democracy, like you said, just sort of always exclusionary? And so there's no way to actually have, a positive democratic policing? I think that's what maybe you're getting at.
I mean, I'm just like, there are people that can vote in America and there are people that cannot vote in America.
Yeah.
People that can vote are excluded from the political community.
Yeah, and so they don't experience the democratic policing, right?
Exactly.
And so a more, deliberative democratic policing process, I'm not really talking about what you'd have to change electorally, but more about what the policing itself should constitute. That's my cop out.
Okay, Dippin, I'm keeping a list. Don't worry. I've seen your hands. But there's several people ahead of you. So.
Thanks, Maya. This was fascinating. Just a quick question on setting up democratic policing in comparison with other norms that do exist, right? So if we were to interrogate IO experts about their understanding of other concepts, let's say peace building or ceasefire monitoring and free and fair elections, whatever, would they be similarly incoherent about their understanding of these concepts? If no, and if there's a certain minimally accepted definition, I think that could make for a great puzzle to say, look, it's not all norms and democratic policing is unique in some way. And if you think you'd find them similarly incoherent, then maybe there's space to kind of open this up as part of a much broader argument about international norms and their understanding by the people that apply them anyway. So this is more of a thought experiment question, but also suggestion if that.
No, I think that's a really generative line of thinking, because I didn't interview people really on anything other than policing. I can't say for sure, but I think you're right. There are certainly aspects, especially of security sector reform, that suffer from the same sort of incoherencies or inconsistencies. Now, I would hazard a guess that things like elections are a little bit, I'm not going to say easy, of course not easy, but defining clear guidelines is more common and has been more common than in the case of policing. And so you might see an easier time with making more coherent normative guidelines for those types of interventions.
Yeah, exactly. And that's your puzzle then, right? That it's not always impossible.
Yeah.
We do it in these different things that IOs, are meant to execute. But when it comes to democratic policing, here's why it's a paradox.
Oh, that's great. That's really helpful. Thank you.
So I'm taking the moderator's privilege to ask the next question. Then we have Jim and Rachel, and behind Rachel and over here, and then you just added yourself to the list. So just so you understand where you stand on the list. So this might actually follow up on what you just said, but I want to ask you a little bit more about this. When you were talking about your previous slide, the contextual dimension, maybe one slide before, importance of contextual knowledge. A lot of the examples that you got from the interviews seem to point to culture, right? But how about these other contexts which are an area I know? Think of community policing was seized upon in the United States State Department and in Latin America as this way we would promote more democratic policing, right? The police will be closer to the people. They'll know the communities better. They'll do a better job. They'll be more sensitive to local concerns. Of course,
and actually very much central, especially to US-led police reform, and it continues to be, although somewhat less now with the reduction in some of those programs. But to your question, I think that matters a lot. It kind of reminds me of the definition from Bailey, right? Of thinking about the balance between individual citizens and private groups, and that's the basic, difficulty, because it's not clear how one should adjudicate that balance. Another version of this paper was a critique of community-oriented policing, which was it's an empty category that is more of a public relations project than it is a project of democratic policing. And so in that sense, it's easy for countries to say they're instituting democratic or community-oriented policing, which usually involves on the ground increased patrols. Maybe you have like programs at schools where police go to give presentations or play sports with kids, and improving, people's access to report crimes. And this doesn't generally, there was a huge meta study across 6 different countries in the global south where they found that these interventions did not improve civilian trust in police or reduce crime. And so I think, these are particularly vulnerable to those sorts of I don't want to say perversions, but that's kind of where I'm leaning, if that makes sense.
All right, let's go to Jim Golgar, and then we'll go to Rachel.
Yeah, thanks so much for the talk. I wanted to ask you about whether there's an assumption built in about that local policing is more democratic than national policing.
Oh, interesting.
Because I mean, we think of, videos from the 1960s from the South where local police were enforcing Jim Crow and required communities that were subject to that. But I just wanted to make sure I understood in your work whether there was a built-in assumption regarding.
Well, that's a great question, Jim. And I think I certainly don't want to make that argument. But I could see how, if you think of deliberative democracy, right, where can you have close public debate where everyone is better heard, certainly at the local level, although you're accepting sort of what Kevin mentioned, right, circumstances of pre-existing inequalities. But to your point directly, I struggle with this a lot in the book project of thinking, is a centralized or decentralized police better? And we've seen this play out in the US multiple times. So with your reference, right, you needed national police to prevent sort of, the crackdown on civil rights protesters. Now we're seeing a valorization of local police, at least in the Minnesota context, against national, against the ICE in particular. And so I think it comes down to that neither one is inherently better. And it really matters, the processes that dictate their oversight. Yeah.
Just as a two-finger, I mean, in federal context, you can always imagine the opportunity for lots of natural experiments.
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
So I'll follow up with you offline, because I think it's a really interesting question. Rachel George?
Yeah, thanks, Maya. It's such an interesting area of research. I wanted to ask you for a second about norm diffusion a little bit more. So I was excited by the way that you're sort of problematizing that. And norm diffusion, as you know, is a famously kind of tricky, messy process. There's sort of Keck and Sikkink, as you cite, who look at TANs. There's the more complex work on like localization from Acharya or vernacularization from Engel-Mary. And, there's parts of this that look at passive processes and some that are much more active. And I'm wondering, I'm compelled by your argument where I think you had on one slide that IO norm diffusion in this area fails because of poor conceptualization. But I'm wondering how you contextualize this more broadly on what is known about the difficult, messy process of norm diffusion, which isn't easy. If you see this area as more underdeveloped or maybe more contested than other areas, given the evidence that most areas of UN IO norm diffusion are rather contested and sometimes underdeveloped. So if you could situate that a bit more.
That's an interesting question. I think policing is always inherently going to be a very difficult norm diffuse, because although early sort of understandings of policing, this comes from like the first meetings of the International Criminal Police Commission, which would become Interpol. The argument is policing should be apolitical, which is of course an ideal type, but the UN very much recognizes now in its reforms that policing is a political project. And so getting agreement on that political project is incredibly difficult. Certainly not helped by the fact that there is no sort of, robust way to adjudicate what a democratic police should look like. But to your question of I think like with Dippin's question, that there would be some that are somewhat better defined and some other that are equally ill-defined, if that makes sense. And it's not to say that the process of diffusion, which a lot of people have pointed out, that those accounts are wrong. I think they're right. But I think they're missing sort of, a precept almost. And this might exist out there, and you'll have to tell me who it is. Of thinking it's not just about how diffusion is done or how amenable local populations are to the norm itself, but what is the norm? How can we understand whether or not it was internalized well if the people promoting it haven't internalized it, right? I don't know if that answers your question, but we should talk more.
Let me go to an online question before we go to you. One of the online questioners asks, you mentioned Haiti, 6 different UN missions to Haiti, and this is a case you've worked on, and maybe if you could draw on it to illustrate some of the problems that you've been talking about in the Q&A, or in your own work.
So I haven't actually done a whole lot of work on Haiti in particular. I would definitely point to Lou Panjot's work, who did a whole book on UN operations in Haiti. I might be a little more comfortable speaking to, I didn't talk about my case studies, but to Bosnia, say, as an example, if it's okay to do that, dear listener. So the case in Bosnia, this is a very complicated case, right? What isn't? But in terms of my theory, right, which predicts that places that are perceived as not only a part of the global South, but also have a history of colonization, are going to be perceived as more permanent security risks. So Bosnia is in the middle. Right? It's in the West-ish, and you see that come out in the dialogue. So I showed you that one quote. There's another quote that's not in this presentation where somebody argued Bosnia was much more successful because we had only basically Western and European police advisors that had a shared understanding of these goals. But on the other hand, that's a very rosy view of Bosnia, and there's not a consensus that police reform was successful at all. There's still quite a lot of debate about, and police reform is ongoing. It went from the UN from 95 to 2002. The EU took it over from 2002 to 2008, and then the OECD and NATO has been involved since. And I think part of that is the lack of the ability to sort of reckon with the politicized nature of ethnic conflict. So rather than question sort of how do we build a more deliberately democratic, to kind of get out of answering a hard question, let's just give quotas for each ethnic group. We'll just institutionalize it, right? This is one approach to democracy. Institutionalize it to ensure minorities have representation. But that is not sufficient often, because it only reinforces the differences and still leads to dissatisfaction with people's representation and a very divided society. Don't know if that answers the question, but I'd love to talk about that more.
Great. Yes. Right behind Rachel.
I had a similar question, honestly, piggybacking off of the UN mission question. Thank you so much for this talk, by the way, about the question of representative policing. But just basically, when these UN missions are so far removed from the community themselves, how it's possible then for them to be able to have strong representation in any sense, especially when there isn't strong local police that exists. And when you said that, for instance, just understanding the context of the local situation isn't sufficient, how we then build that representation.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. Something I hadn't thought about, which is, the UN itself is really not a paragon of deliberative democracy, right? If we have a more critical view of it. I will say that, and you're right, that the local police has often completely collapsed in these post-conflict situations. But say in the case of Bosnia, there's a lot of work with local police. And that representation, a more deliberative democratic approach, would require a much more robust system of debate for these folks. So in this way, the critiques against these diffusion pathways, which tend to prioritize donor interest or the UN interest over local interest, really plays out on the ground, because you don't see local police necessarily getting the opportunity to be at decision-making positions. But the argument is, well, we talk to them. That's, some form of deliberation. But if you're not in the decision-making positions or in any sort of in the room where it happens, right, then of course you're not going to be able to have
Yes, you. And then we'll go to you.
Thank you for the talk. My name is Leo Spader. I'm a Marine Corps officer doing a fellowship for a year here at Hoover. I really appreciate the way you address counterinsurgency and insurgency, because that was going to be my question coming in. But I think the legacy of colonial policing, which really was a lot of counterinsurgency, and then some of the case studies may be challenging your ability to give specific implications. And I say that because across the time series of the security environment, from pure anarchy, the insurgency is winning, to what we have in Palo Alto, where we can truly police in that term, really affects both the orientation of the police forces from across Iraq, Afghanistan, and Liberia, of 3 anecdotal studies I've been a part of, unfortunately. You are adversary focused in counterinsurgency, and then you become more population centric as you go. But that also affects the way that the advisors from police advisor teams from subject matter experts of here's how you do bomb exploitation and network analysis, versus now we're pushing the rule of law and individual rights. I think maybe breaking up some of your examples, or at least categorizing them by where they are in phase, may help be able to give very clear distinctions, especially, what we see in Minneapolis is counterinsurgency strategy from the way that the forces are designed and present, versus the Minneapolis police that are still in a community-oriented, stable, stable security environment, where they are not looking like, Rambo 4.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. I appreciate, especially sort of the counterinsurgency. And I addressed this a little bit in the book, this idea that, well, certainly some contexts are different. But I will just say in response to that, somewhat pushing back, is that once you really invest in a more counterinsurgency or coercive mindset, it's very hard to roll that back. And so kind of treating that as, what happens is that these interveners tend to say, okay, well, we can't get to democratic policing now, but that's the goal later. First, we got to establish. So my sort of point as on the verge of crisis, and maybe they are, maybe they aren't, but certainly the policing in that respect isn't necessarily providing the stability needed to get to that space, if that makes sense. But yeah, that counterinsurgency history is going to be a part of it.
I wonder if it wouldn't help if you complexified the framework a bit by adding a third element. That is private interests, whether it be the robber barons and Homestead strike, or the gangs in New York City in the 60s who had the police working for them, Northern Ireland, one ethnic group over another. And so also to add the class dimension to the race and gender as well into the framework.
Yeah, that's very important. And a lot of the, Neocleos is one of the biggest critical policing scholars, is really based on a class critique of policing. And policing was really in part born as a way to organize capitalism, right? To ensure that there were no unproductive people, or that people that were idle were put into some sort of more productive position. So yeah, I take that point seriously. I tend to see the opposite happen, which is an over-focus on the class aspects and not on the race and gendered aspects. But I think that's a good point to sort of remember to keep them all in mind.
So would you then have to add that into the framework to the autocratic democratic? Private, or there must be a
that's interesting.
term for it?
Yeah, I mean, I think just spitballing here, one answer could be that we're at a time when capitalism is pretty. I'm not going to argue, there is variation, but it's pretty consistent across some democracies and autocracies. It's not only the purview of democracy. So in that sense, the economic angle or the private property angle is actually more stable than some might imply. It'd be interesting, though, to look at that in terms of the Cold War and how that impacted. And there's a lot of this sort of international policing going on at that time, too. Okay.
Great, thank you. Let's go to Emily, and then we'll go to Andrew Bell in the back.
Hi, Maya. Great to see this project finally bloom into a book. I wanted to ask you a question that was really drawn from the interviews that I got, that you were presenting, and trying to understand what's the core of this conceptualization issue that you're having.
Yeah.
One thing I noticed in one of the slides, where you said, the interviewee said, sure, policing could be democratic even in an authoritarian or post-authoritarian regime if it has respect for universal human rights. But most of the other responses were based on like, community demands, what the community wants. And so one thing I thought was if what the community wants is for violence or crime to end,
Yep.
and in often cases, this is the state that wants it, right?
Yep.
Then that sort of gives this veneer of democracy, which has nothing to do with inalienable rights, right?
Sure.
So I guess I'm curious if there's if you would distinguish would you want democratic policing to be more aligned with a human rights oriented definition of policing rather than a community oriented policing framework? And I guess, would you say that those three terms are interchangeable? Because you mentioned human rights oriented policing, but you didn't really go into it. So are those three terms currently interchangeable, or would you say that democratic policing and community oriented policing are very similar, but human rights oriented is very different, or are all three of those?
No, I think they're all three used interchangeably. I don't know that means that they're the same, but really what I'm trying to point out is that the people who are hired to conduct these reforms cannot easily distinguish between the three. And so regardless of what I would define it as or what I think it should be, the sort of confusion about each and what the lines are between them affects what the actual outcomes for such reforms are.
So I guess my question...
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to clarify. So I think my question is, would you define truly democratic policing, which is sort of what your paper is in search of, to mean something sort of baked in that is not context dependent? Or that you can't say, democratic policing is you don't pepper spray civilians or something like that. Or is it more complicated than that?
No, that's a great question. Actually, I'm hesitant to be like, I say, because I don't necessarily want to make a normative assumption on my own part. But if we're, talking outside of the paper, I think there should be some way, right, where you can get to an idea of democratic policing that is not context dependent. And honestly, that is how they articulate it. It's the application that becomes context dependent. And there is, this is a tough balance. It always has been, between respecting local context and involving an international actor in reforms. And there are many reasons some states have more or less control over whether or not they receive international interventions in these ways. But, as most people who study this and critique it, I end with sort of an unsatisfying, there needs to be more dialogue. And so that's part of what this should be, right? I think you're right, as an effort of, okay, what would that look like? What are some actual policy prescriptions or concrete suggestions that would get us there? And that's something I'm still working on.
Great. And before we go to Andrew, let's go to the front row. And if you could just please say who you are and your affiliation.
Okay, I just have a very quick question. I'm not convinced that we can relate democracy to the police.
Yeah.
The job of the police is to basically enforce the law. But the law got to be the law of peoples, as Rawls and Habermas and if you want to relate police to democracy, then we need to relate prison system to democracy, and the list goes on and on and on. So I think we got to look at the law. The law got to be the laws of people.
Yeah, and I think that definitely tracks with what a lot of reformers themselves think about what democratic policing should be. But the problem is that the law itself is variable. And so how do you have an international reforms for democratic policing? But I agree with you fundamentally that the two together, there's a lot of tension.
We'll take one last question from Andrew Bell in the back.
Hi, Andrew Bell, a CSAC research scholar. Great presentation. I love this research. I think it's really interesting. So I want to talk with you more about it offline. Yes, but please. I'll use my position being here at the tail end, and we can talk if we have more time to answer it when the session ends. First one is, having worked at the ICRC before, and we've talked about this a little bit, seeing how difficult in some ways or how tenuous the connection can be between the international organization and the local police context.
Mm.
And so I'm wondering how you are able to incorporate that into your
Mhm.
model systematically.
Yeah, yeah.
How do you tackle that? And then secondly, I'd love to see more of your empirics for the broader project as well. How do your interviews lead you to understand say the predominance of your understanding of your theory, or is this another explanation? Is yours dispositive? How do you fit that in terms of the competing explanations that you're
Sure.
doing well as well?
I'll do my best with that. So in terms of the first, that is something interesting. I hadn't thought it was sort of, and because this isn't really a quantitatively oriented project that's trying to find a causal explanation, I hadn't thought through keeping sort of something like that constant. Like, okay, well, how do we control for the actual degree of relevance the international actors have on the reform context? But that is a fair question. I guess I would just point to, the fact that even in the best cases, so the UN in Bosnia is one of them, but more so in Kosovo, when they have executive are getting at either, because it's also about the degree of connection with the local population. But that's something to think about, and I think would be essential to understanding how deliberatively democratic the process is. And then, sorry, I can answer your second question. I don't know that I fully understand it, but we could talk offline. Thank you.